You are most welcome to our lesson for today, which is lesson number 24 on our series of lessons on the books of Daniel and Revelation. Today we are looking at Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 to 13, with a subtopic, the King of the North at Jerusalem. It is at least likely that no further revelation would have been imparted to Daniel except for his own eager desire to know what the future held in store for God's people and God's plan following the rejection of the Jews. It seems that the actual vision was imparted by Christ in person if you read Daniel chapter 10 verses 4 to 9. But not one word is said regarding what he saw and heard save for the graphic description of Christ himself. It was nevertheless a great vision, according to Daniel chapter 10, verse 8. And Daniel understood it. That's verse 1. The explanation, however, was entrusted to Gabriel and is recorded in chapter 11 and the first 4 verses of chapter 12. Perhaps Daniel was shown what John later saw in vision, particularly in the 12th to the 19th chapters of the book of Revelation, but with slightly varying emphasis. The ambiguous phraseology of Daniel chapter 11 is without doubt due to the fact that its message is primarily concerned with the transition from literal Israel to the Christian church and the experiences of the latter to the close of time, as Gabriel explained to Daniel when he said, I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. That is what we read in Daniel chapter 10 verse 14. Inspiration, no doubt, purposely made it ambiguous so that the Jews could not understand it, or for that matter, anyone prior to the time of the end. Actually, Daniel chapter 11 summarizes in great detail all that had been presented to the prophet previously, and therefore close parallels the two preceding visions, or particularly that of Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9. Because of its ambiguity, great care must be exercised in attempting an interpretation. Perhaps the safest approach is to recognize that it is parallel to the preceding visions and to follow them closely where its own meaning is not clear, or where, due to our limited understanding of it, there seem to be two possible interpretations. Careful comparison with the two preceding prophecies makes the similarity obvious. The statement of Gabriel himself when he said, I am come to make thee understand what shall befall people in the latter days, should be accepted as the guiding principle in essaying to understand its cryptic phraseology. In other words, every detail of the vision is of different concern to God's people, and every power introduced must affect them directly. To proceed otherwise would be to deviate from Gabriel's own announcement. There is a general agreement in the interpretation down to verse 36, right? But from there on to the close of the chapter, there is considerable divergence of opinion. This is due to part to the cryptic phraseology, and in part to the fact that the closing verses of the chapter are still future in application and cannot as yet be understood with absolute certainty. There is growing unanimity of opinion, and among those who have devoted time to the study of the chapter during recent years. And without doubt, this tendency will be complete when the time comes for God's people to understand these things. So, friends, we can only explain what has been revealed, and what is yet to be revealed at the right time God will reveal to his people as we search deeper in the Word of God. The world is steered with the spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. Let's start off now with verse 1. Daniel chapter 11 verse 1. It says, "Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." Daniel's prayer had been offered in the first year of Darius, according to verse 1. The Median monarch, whose general Cyrus had wrested from Babylonia the scepter of universal rule. The reign of Darius was honored of God. To him was sent the angel Gabriel to confirm and to strengthen him. That's what Daniel 11 verse 1 says. So upon his death, within about 2 years of the fall of Babylon, Cyrus succeeded to the throne, and the beginning of his reign marked the completion of the 70 years since the first company of Hebrews had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar from their Judean home to Babylon. Now I want us to look at a verse and comment, from verses 2 until the end of verse 13. Verse 2 says, "And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all." 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. What are we talking about here in verse 2? I want to share the following comments. The 3 kings in Persia. Inasmuch as this vision was given to Daniel in the 3rd year of Cyrus, the reference is doubtless to the 3 kings who followed Cyrus on the throne of Persia. These were Cambyses from 530 to 522 BC, the false Semidis, whose Babylonian name was Badia, 348 to 349, and Asapa, 522 BC, and Darius I, 522 to 486 BC. Then they referred to the 4th, who shall be richer than they all. The 4th. Scholars generally agree that the context points to Xerxes as the 4th king. Was far richer. Xerxes is to be identified with the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. Also, on Esther, Herodotus, who wrote on the length of Xerxes, leaves a vivid, detailed account of his military might. There is much information we get about Xerxes, his riches, and his military might. Now let's look at verse 3. "And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will." This mighty king shall stand up. A mighty king. Here the context, a valiant king or a mighty king. This clearly refers to a King Alexander the Great from 336 to 323 BC with great dominion. Alexander's dominion extended from Macedonia and Greece to northwestern India, from Egypt to the Jazax River east of the Caspian Sea, the largest empire the world had yet known until that time. He had great dominion than the previous kingdoms. And then verse 4. And when he shall stand up, this king, his kingdom shall be broken. We're talking of Greece. We're talking of Alexander the Great, right? And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. So his kingdom, Greece, will be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven. So the kingdom of Greece will be divided into four when Alexander the Great dies, or when his reign comes to an end. Within his kingdom, there will be a division of four divisions, and not to his posterity. This leadership, or whoever will take over, will not be his own son. It will not be his own posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. No, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, or plucked up you can replace with broken up, even for others beside those. Let's quickly have a look here on verse 4. When he shall stand up, Alexander had scarcely reached the pinnacle of his power when he was cut down, or when his reign came to an abrupt end. In 323 BC, the king who ruled from the Adriatic to the Indus suddenly fell ill, and 11 days later was dead. You need to just read a little about Alexander the Great and find out how he died. He was dead within a short period of time. And it says, shall be broken up. Alexander left no one in his immediate family who could be expected to hold together the territories he had won. Hence, we read about not of his own posterity. Some of the leading generals tried for a number of years, as history tells us that his four generals divided the kingdom into four divisions, and they each ruled a section. But they failed to hold it together for years, to hold the empire intact in the name of Alexander's half-brother and his posthumous son, both under regents. But in less than 25 years after Alexander's death, a coalition of four generals had defeated Antigonus, the last aspirant to the control of the whole empire, and Alexander's territory was divided into four kingdoms and later reduced to three. For the division, the four winds that are also referred to here, representing the four quarters of the compass. The same division is represented by the four heads of a leopard. If you were to read chapter 7 of Daniel, verse 6, we read about the kingdom of Greece, which is represented by a leopard that had four heads, if you remember. It represented Alexander the Great, who later his kingdom towards the end is ruled by his four generals, represented in Daniel chapter 7 by the four heads. Or if you looked at the goat, Daniel chapter 8, verse 8 and 22, and by the four horns of the goat. That's also another symbol that was used or is used in the prophecies to try and explain to us the nature of the kingdom of Greece. Not to his posterity, Alexander's posthumous son was called king, but he was killed while still a child in the struggle between the generals over the actual rule of the empire. Thus, there was no descendant of Alexander who ruled after him. That was verse 4. That was verse 4. And I want us to look at verse 5. Excuse me. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Quickly, three things. We hear about the first time of the king of the south, one of his princes, and being strong above him. What meaneth these things? The king of the south. From this point on through much of this chapter, the prophecy focuses on the two kingdoms emerging from Alexander's empire, with which God's people, the Jews, had most to do. These were Syria, ruled by the Seleucids, and Egypt, ruled by Ptolemy. So it's Syria and Egypt. From the geographical standpoint of Palestine, the former was north and the latter was south. So you will hear going forward in this chapter about the king of the south and the king of the north. And we are talking in context of what happened then. We are talking of Syria and Egypt. The original Greek translation, in fact, has king of Egypt for king of the south. King of Egypt for king of the south. Also, verse 8 points to Egypt as king of the south. So there we have proof, we have got biblical support, who is king of the south, that we are referring to Egypt. A similar designation can be demonstrated from historical sources. One of the best known South Arabian inscriptions, called Glacier number 1155, refers to a war between Persia and Egypt and calls the respective kings the Lord of the North and the Lord of the South. At the point in history referred to in this verse, the king of Egypt was Ptolemy I Soter, also called son of Lagus, who ruled from 305 BC to 283 BC. One of Alexander's best generals, who established the most enduring of all the Hellenistic monarchies. Then we had a reference to one of his princes. This evidently applies to Seleucidius, one Nicator, from 305 BC to 281 BC, another of Alexander's generals, who made himself ruler of most of the Asiatic part of the empire. That he should here be spoken of as one of his, that is Ptolemy's princes or generals. We can refer to Daniel chapter 10 verse 13, is probably to be understood in the light of his relations with Ptolemy. In 316 BC, Seleucus was driven from Babylonia, which he had held since 321, by his rival Antigonus. You can see chapter 7 verse 6. Thereupon Seleucus placed himself under the command of Ptolemy, whom he assisted in defeating Demetrius, son of Antigonus, at Gaza in 312 BC. Shortly after this, Seleucus succeeded in regaining his territories in Mesopotamia. This is history, beautiful history that supports the Bible that we are reading today, the prophecy that we are reading today. Then we read about strong above him. This refers to Seleucus, who at one time could be considered one of Ptolemy's princes, later became stronger than the Egyptian king, hence strong above him, because we are talking in the context of king of the south and king of the north. So he later became stronger than the Egyptian king. When Seleucus died in 281 BC, his realm extended from the Hellespont to northern India. Arrian, the leading ancient historian for this period, states that Seleucus was the greatest king of those who succeeded Alexander, and the most royal mind, and ruled over the greatest territory, greatest extent of the territory, next to Alexander. So, of all the territories, 4 territories that were there, he ruled most of it. Then let's go back to verse 6. And in the end of the years, they shall join themselves. Remember, we're still talking in the context of the king of the south and north. In the end of years, they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. Quickly. Verse 6. We hear of end of years. The prophetic view next focuses on a crisis about 35 years after the death of Seleucus I. We are told they joined themselves to solidify peace between the two kingdoms after a long and costly war. Antiochus II, Theos, who ruled from 261 BC to 246, grandson of Seleucus I, married Berenice, a daughter of the Egyptian king Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Antiochus also deposed his former wife and sister, Laodice, from his position of priority, and debarred her children from succession to the throne. That's the history. This was written before it occurred, but we are reading today afterwards as history. Then we hear of King of the North. This term is used here for the first time in this prophecy. In the present context, it refers to Seleucidas, whose territories were north of Palestine. The then king of the north was Seleucus II Callimachus, from 246 to 226, son of Antiochus II and Laodice. On the expressions king of the north and king of the south, we can refer to verse 5 or Isaiah 41 verse 25. The verse also said, shall not return the power. After a son had been born to the new marriage, a reconciliation was effected between Antiochus and Laodice. The verse also said, neither shall he stand. What did it mean? Antiochus died suddenly, poisoned, according to popular opinion, by Laodice. His arm, by a simple change in Hebrew vowels, several ancient versions. This is what they refer to, read his seed, when they talk of his arm, his seed. This would then refer to Antiochus' son by Berenice, whom Laodice killed. There was the phrase given up, that is Berenice, who along with her infant son was killed by the henchmen of Laodice, that they brought her. That's another phrase we read. Many of Berenice's Egyptian ladies in waiting perished with her. They died with her. And then there was a phrase, the last phrase there was, he that begat her. The Hebrew word Yoleda, correctly, according to Mesoteric tradition means her begetter. This would of course apply to Berenice's father Ptolemy II, who had died shortly before in Egypt. It is not clear, however, why his death should be mentioned here, as it was entirely apart from the vengeance wrought by Lodis. Several ancient translations read Yalda or maid, doubtless having in mind Berenice's entourage. A simple change in a vowel pointing permits to read her child. This would of course refer to her son, who was killed by command of Lodis, he that strengthened him. Antiochus, that is Berenice's husband. Now let's go to verse 7. Bit of juggling with words here, because it's a lot of history that I have to read it verbatim. Verse 7. But out of the branch of her roots shall one stand in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. What does this mean? A branch of her roots. Ptolemy II, son of Ptolemy III, Euergetes, son of Ptolemy II, and brother of Berenice, succeeded his father in 246 BC and invaded Syria in revenge for his sister's murder. Shall prevail. Ptolemy III seems to have been entirely victorious in his campaign against Seleucus II. He pressed his conquests inland at least as far as Mesopotamia, though he boasted of having penetrated to Bactria, and he established Egyptian sea power on the Mediterranean. Verse 8. And shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the kings of the north. That's verse 8. Egypt. This sole occurrence until verse 42 of the actual name of the country of the king of the south established beyond doubt the identity of that land. That king of the south is Egypt. Talked about their gods. The decree of Canopus 239 to 238 BC states in praise of Ptolemy III, and the sacred images carried off from the land of the Persians, the king, having made a foreign campaign, recovered into Egypt and restored to the temples from which each of them had been carried away. States that Ptolemy III brought back immense booty to Egypt. There is a phrase also that was shared, he shall continue. Literally, it means he shall stand. That is, he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north, although it is possible to translate the Hebrew as does the King James Version. The fact that Ptolemy III died in 222 BC, not 2 years after Seleucus III, would seem to make such a rendering not very meaningful. On the other hand, since in his latter years Ptolemy was not engaged in warfare of any importance, the alternative translation of the Hebrew seems more appropriate. Verse 9. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. What means this, king of the south? The Hebrew here may be understood either as in the King James Version, where it says king of the south is taken as the subject of the sentence. So also the Vulgate Syriac, or as in the LXS, ASV and RSV, where king of the south is attached to the kingdom. The latter versions support the reading, he will come into the kingdom of the king of the south. This translation seems preferable because it follows more naturally the Hebrew word order. It does not necessitate the insertion of the word his before kingdom, and it makes the verse more meaningful and less redundant. If this translation is accepted, the verse is doubtless to be interpreted as a reference to the fact that after Ptolemy III had returned to Egypt, Seleucus re-established his authority and marched against that country, hoping to retrieve his riches and regain his prestige. Return to his own land. Seleucus was defeated and forced to return to Syria empty-handed at about 240 BC. Verse 10. But his sons shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his first fortress. That's verse 10. His sons, that is the two sons of Seleucus II and Seleucus III. That's Serenus Soter, who was murdered after a short reign, and Antiochus III the Great. It's said they would overflow and pass through. In 219 BC, Antiochus III initiated his campaign for southern Syria and Palestine by retaking Seleucia, the port of Antioch. Thereafter, he set up upon a systematic campaign to conquer Palestine from his rival, Ptolemy IV, from 222 to 204 BC, during which he penetrated Transjordan. Verse 11. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall send forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. That's verse 11. Moved with choler, that word, Choler. What does it mean? It means, it's an English word for anger. Moved with anger. So you could substitute it to mean moved with anger. Ptolemy IV met Antiochus at Raphia near the Palestinian-Egyptian border. The antecedents of the various pronouns in this verse become clearer when it is recognized that the passage is in the form of Hebrew inverted parallelism, in which the first and the fourth elements and the second and third are in parallel. Thus, in this verse, the references are as follows: King of the south, King of the north. He, King of the north, he is King of the south. That's how the Hebrew structure is of writing. A great multitude. Polybius, the leading ancient historian for this period, states that Antiochus' armies numbered 62,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, 102 elephants. Ptolemy's troops seem to have been of about the same number. You can compare the reference in 10,000. That is when you look at verse 12. Given into his hand, the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC between Antiochus III and Ptolemy IV resulted in a stinging defeat for the former, who is reported to have lost 10,000 infantry, 300 cavalry, plus 4,000 prisoners. Verse 12. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. The reference to he is for Ptolemy IV, not to be strengthened, indolent, and dissolute. Ptolemy failed to make the best of the victory at Raphia. In the meantime, during the years 212 BC to 204 BC, Antiochus III turned his energies to recovering his eastern territories and campaigned successfully as far as the border of India. Ptolemy IV's death in 205 BC was concealed for some time. Then a son aged 4 or 5 succeeded him as Ptolemy V Epiphanes from 204 BC to 180 BC. That is for verse 12. Verse 13. For the king of the north shall return and shall set forth multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. Shall return. I'm interested in that phrase. The ascension of the child Ptolemy V presented Antiochus III with the opportunity of avenging himself upon the Egyptians. In 201 BC, he invaded Palestine again. And the phrase "after many years," literally at the end of times, that is years, the reference is probably to the period of some 16 years from 217 to 201 BC, between the Battle of Raphia, you can refer to verse 11, and Antiochus' second campaign against the south. Beautiful history. I pray that God may help us as we are going to go further with this history in our next lesson. I have to pause here because there is a lot of history. You may think you have not gained much today. Hold your horses and wait. We are going to see some beautiful ending to this. May God bless you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.